This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 540th MTG Top 10. In this series, I typically rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition, but lately I've been mixing in another type of video from time to time, and those are videos that look at the most expensive cards in a particular category, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the game's most expensive enchantments. There are a few rules regarding how I constructed this list. The first is that a set can only appear on this list once. For any set that would have had multiple inclusions on the list, I'll just be talking about the 3 most expensive enchantments from that set. This allows us to talk about a wider variety of Magic cards from across the game's eras, instead of the list leaning heavily towards really old cards. Additionally, the prices in this video are the near mint prices for those cards on Card Kingdom at the time of recording, and it is possible that those prices have since changed. As always, if you're interested in buying any of the cards that appear in this video, you can find a direct Card Kingdom link in the description. Alright, let's dive into the list. At number 10, it is EarthCraft, which costs around $150. This enchantment from 1997's Tempest allows you to tap an untapped creature you control to untap a basic land. This is an effect with some pretty absurd combo potential, so much that it became a serious problem in multiple formats. It was one of the many cards that helped create the so-called combo winter, an era between 1998 and 1999 where combo decks dominated basically all of Magic. EarthCraft could combine with Sacred Mesa and Wild Growth to create an infinite number of Pegasus tokens. You would tap the enchanted land to produce 2 mana to make a Pegasus, and then tap that Pegasus to untap the Wild Growth land, rinse, and repeat. This resulted in EarthCraft getting banned in both Standard and Extended. Several years later, people began combining it with Squirrel Nest in Legacy and Vintage to create a 2-card combo that allowed you to make as many squirrels as you wanted. This led to it getting restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy. It has since been unrestricted in Vintage, but remains banned in Legacy today because there are so many potential combos. Right now, EarthCraft isn't really seeing play anywhere, but the card has an impressive history, and as we've seen in this series, it does play some role in helping a card hold on to a high price tag. EarthCraft is played in EDH too, though it isn't anywhere close to being a staple. It's in almost 10,000 decks on EDHREC. Obviously enough, it usually shows up in decks that can do some combos with it. So in the here and now, EarthCraft isn't in super high demand. However, the card is pretty hard to find. It's part of the reserved list, which means Wizards of the Coast has promised never to reprint the card, apart from in super limited releases or in releases that aren't tournament legal. And in this case, they haven't even done any of that. It hasn't been reprinted as a secret lair or anything like that. The Tempest version of EarthCraft is the only one there is, and that combined with EarthCraft's impressive combo potential and prominent history has led to it being the 10th most expensive enchantment in all of Magic. At number 9, it is Doubling Season, in particular the Double Masters box topper version of the card, which costs about $160. Doubling Season doubles the number of tokens and counters your effects put into play. This can do some pretty insane stuff in a deck that likes making tokens and or counters, however it's probably the most insane with Planeswalkers. If you play a Planeswalker with Doubling Season in play, it enters with twice its normal loyalty, which often means it can ultimate right away. While Doubling Season has never had any impact on Magic's competitive formats, it is very heavily played in EDH. It can be found in over 70,000 decks on EDHREC, or 8% of decks, which is pretty darn impressive. This means that Doubling Season is in high demand, and this particular version of the card was a box topper for Double Masters. That means the only way to obtain it was to buy an entire box of Double Masters. This version is entirely unique too, as it features art that is both not on any other version of the card, and it also is extended. At number 8, it is Blood Moon, in particular the Invocation version of the card, which costs about $170. Blood Moon turns all non-basic lands into mountains, so it is great at hosing non-basic lands, which power a ton of decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. This has made it a heavily played sideboard card ever since being printed, and there are even decks in both Modern and Legacy which main deck Blood Moon and have it as a central aspect of the deck's game plan, as it allows them to disrupt almost every deck in the format. Additionally, Blood Moon is also commonly played in EDH, where it tends to be a pretty great fit for mono-red commanders, since you can really make it one-sided. It's in over 35,000 decks on EDHREC, so yeah, Blood Moon is in high demand in several of Magic's biggest formats, and this version is incredibly hard to find. Invocations were incredibly rare cards that appeared in Amonkhet booster packs. Blood Moon is from the Hour of Devastation set of invocations. They were sort of like retro frame artifacts in the Brothers' War, in that they tended to be important cards from Magic's history, and they were special versions, but they were way, way rarer. You get a retro frame artifact in every pack of the Brothers' War. You were lucky if you got one invocation in a box of Hour of Devastation. These cards are foil and feature a pretty cool Egyptian-inspired frame, as you can see here. That's what makes this particular version of Blood Moon so expensive. At number 7, I have Rustic Study, in particular the Judge gift card version from 2018. If you play Commander, chances are you see this card all the time, as it's one of the most widely played cards in the entire format. You can find it in more than 281,000 decks on EDHREC. Basically, if you're playing blue, you're playing Rustic Study. Every time an opponent casts a spell, they have to pay 1 generic mana or you get to draw a card. This gets particularly powerful in multiplayer games, since it will trigger so many more times if you have multiple opponents. Basically, whoever controls Rustic Study tends to generate absurd amounts of card advantage. Like Doubling Season, Rustic Study has never been played in Magic's other formats, so its value is entirely a result of its massive popularity in Commander. Earlier in this series, we saw that the common version of the card is one of the most expensive commons in the game, so it should come as no surprise that a much harder to find version of the card is worth even more. This version of Rustic Study was given to Magic judges as a gift in 2018. Like most judge gifts, this means it is foil and features unique art that hasn't been utilized on other versions of the card. Basically, this is the fanciest version of Rustic Study there is. At number 6, it is Power Artifact from Antiquities. This enchantment attaches to artifacts and reduces the cost of their activated abilities by 2 mana. Power Artifact hasn't ever really seen play at Magic's highest level of competition, and it isn't widely played in EDH either, with fewer than 4,000 decks using the card. This is a case where the card's value is based almost entirely on how scarce it is, because the demand isn't very high among anyone but collectors. This is another card on the reserved list that hasn't been reprinted in any capacity at all, so if you do want to play Power Artifact, this is the only option, and it was printed way back in 1994, so there aren't many of them left out there, especially in good condition. At number 5, it is Glorious Anthem, in particular, the Junior APAC promo version of the card, which will set you back about $580. Glorious Anthem gives your whole board +1/+1, and it's a fairly iconic card in Magic, to the point that people call static effects that buff their whole board anthems. It has been played a bit at Magic's highest level of competition, usually in white aggro decks, and it's also played in around 9,000 EDH decks on EDHREC. So there is some reasonable demand for the Anthem, but this is a card where scarcity plays the biggest role in driving up the price. This card was only available as part of the reward for doing well in the Junior League in the Asia-Pacific region in 2009. These were a series of special events that had an age cutoff for participants, hence the junior part. These cards feature a unique foil pattern, including an APAC Junior Series stamp in the text box. There were other regional versions of this Anthem released, but this is the one that's the hardest to find. There just aren't a whole lot of them in circulation right now, driving up the price. At number 4, it is the Arabian Nights card Drop of Honey, which costs $750. The drop has an incredibly unique and powerful effect. During each of your upkeeps, it destroys the creature in play with the least power. That can offer some pretty impressive value for only 1 mana. If there aren't any creatures around, you do have to sacrifice it. It would be pretty absurd if you didn't. Right now, Drop of Honey is played in lands decks in Legacy. These decks are one of the most prominent archetypes in the format, so there's actually some significant demand for this card. That deck doesn't run very many creatures, so it can really use the drop to dismantle the opponent's board while it tries to set up its land-based combos. It sees hardly any play in EDH, though it is certainly a card that would see a lot more play if it wasn't so hard to get your hands on. Arabian Nights cards are some of the hardest to find, with only alpha and beta cards being rarer, and of course Drop of Honey is also on the reserved list, so if you want one, this is your only option. And there are plenty of Legacy players who do want some Drops of Honey. Although if you're in the market for a white version of this card, that is much more attainable, Planar Chaos featured Porphyry nodes, which is a color-shifted version of the drop, and you can pick one up for about 50 cents. At number 3, I've got 3 cards from Legends: Chains of Mephistopheles, Moat, and the Abyss. All 3 of these cards would have easily made the list, as the Abyss is the cheapest of the bunch at $1,100. All 3 of these cards are from a very rare set, and they're all on the reserved list, and they're also in relatively high demand. Chains is famously one of the wordiest cards in the game. If a player would draw a card except for the first one in a turn, instead they discard a card, and when they do, they draw a card. If they can't discard a card, instead one card gets milled. Basically, it's an effective way to hate on decks trying to draw multiple cards, and it can also be used to load the graveyard for various shenanigans. It sees play in Legacy and Vintage, and a fair bit of play in EDH2, appearing in almost 3,000 decks on EDHREC. At least, that's a fair bit of decks for a card that costs $1,500. Moat is a much simpler card than Chains. It makes it so non-flying creatures can't attack, which gives it an elegant and flavorful design. In the past, it saw significant play in competitive Magic 2, especially in Legacy, where it was utilized in Miracle decks. They usually sought to win the game with a huge Entreat the Angels, which could ignore the Moat, and in the meantime, it would protect you from opposing attackers. These days, though, it isn't really seeing play anywhere. Lastly, there's the Abyss. This world enchantment forces each player to destroy one of their own non-artifact creatures during their upkeep. This can allow a control mage to gain control of a situation, especially because if they have no creatures of their own, this becomes pretty one-sided. If you utilize artifact creatures or creatures with hexproof, you can also ignore the effect. Like Moat, the Abyss has a fairly impressive competitive history, but isn't really seeing play anywhere right now. In short, none of these cards see a lot of play anywhere these days, but all 3 are fairly famous cards that are hard to obtain. At number 2, it is Survival of the Fittest, in particular the Judge foil version, which costs about $1,700. The original version of Survival is also quite expensive at $230, and it would have made this list if I gave it its own slot, but obviously it makes more sense to include them here together since, they're the same card. Survival of the Fittest is one of the most powerful enchantments in the game and has enabled lots of powerful decks ever since being printed. It allows you to pay 1 green mana and discard a creature card to search up any creature card from your deck and put it into your hand. This tutor effect is strong, but it gets even sillier in decks that are built to abuse Survival of the Fittest, and there have been decks doing that for over 25 years. The first deck to do this was a standard deck that combined it with Recurring Nightmare. This nasty combo meant you could discard a card you wanted to reanimate while also tutoring up something else. This was Magic's very first Reanimator deck, and its first Toolbox deck, meaning Survival of the Fittest holds an important spot in Magic history. The card was great in enabling creature-based combos too, as it could so easily allow you to find your combo pieces. This was a big problem that got Survival banned in both Extended and Legacy, and it remains banned in Legacy today. This means Vintage is the only format it is legal in, but it's powerful enough that it has even powered decks there. Additionally, it's in very high demand in EDH, as tutors often are. Around 24,000 decks use the card on EDHREC. So, obviously, all of this means that people want to play with Survival of the Fittest in multiple formats, and it's not easy to get your hands on. It's another card on the reserved list, so the only way you can use the card is to get the original version from Exodus, or this Judge foil. If you want a foil version of Survival for your Commander deck, you can only do that by obtaining the Judge foil, as foil cards didn't exist back in Exodus. And as is often the case, the Judge foil version of the card features different art, and that always seems to drive up demand for a card. However, despite having all of that in its favor, Survival doesn't come in at number 1. Instead, as you probably expected for number 1, we've got the 3 most expensive enchantments from Alpha: Copy Artifact, Stasis, and Raging River. Alpha is of course Magic's very first set, and also by far the game's rarest set, as it only had a very limited print run. After all, no one was really sure the game would be successful. So what makes these 3 enchantments more expensive than the rest? Well, they are of course all on the reserved list, but that's true of lots of enchantments in Alpha, so there are some other factors at play here. Copy Artifact is the most efficient way there is to duplicate an artifact, as for only 2 mana, it can come into play as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield. It was in one of the top 8 decks at Magic's first major competitive event ever, the 1994 World Championship, but apart from that, it hasn't made a lot of noise in competitive Magic. However, it is sought after in EDH and pretty much an auto-include in any blue artifact deck, since getting a copy of the best artifact on the table for just 2 mana is often a pretty great deal. Even in non-artifact decks, it will often have something juicy to copy in Commander. While the alpha version of the card is super costly, the revised version is much more affordable at about $50, so it's a card people can actually get their hands on in one form or another, but if they want the coolest version there is, and EDH players often want that, this is it. Stasis, meanwhile, is a prison enchantment that offers a unique effect. It stops both players from having an untap step. It was the centerpiece of Magic's very first prison deck back in 1996, making it fairly iconic. It hasn't done much lately, but it is certainly one of Magic's most well-known enchantments, especially for players in their 30s and 40s. The art on the card is polarizing, and I don't like it myself, but when I've bashed it before, it has had lots of defenders. At the very least, the art on the card has a cool story behind it. Its artist, Faye Jones, is Richard Garfield's aunt, and she did this art for him as a favor. She is a fairly famous mainstream artist, and this is the only card she ever did, which does add another group of collectors to the mix. It's also fairly popular in EDH. If you're looking for a more affordable version of the card, it is available. You can get the 5th edition version for only $7. Lastly, there's Raging River. This being the 3rd most expensive enchantment in Alpha is a little bit of a surprise. Both Copy Artifact and Stasis are powerful cards that have done at least a little bit in both competitive Magic and EDH. Raging River, not so much. It has never even sniffed competitive play, and fewer than 500 decks on EDH Rec use it. It certainly has a unique effect, but it isn't really that impressive. When you attack, your opponent has to put their cards in a left and right pile, symbolizing either side of the river. After they do that, you get to decide which pile to put your creatures in. Your opponent can only block creatures on the same side of the river as their creatures. This is very flavorful and creates a pretty unique experience that kind of changes the game's rules, but I don't think anyone would tell you that it's strong. The unique effect is part of the reason the card is so expensive, but there's something else too. Unlike both Copy Artifact and Stasis, Raging River is only available in Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited. It was not included in any of the later sets like Revised or 5th edition, meaning the number of Raging Rivers out there is even lower than the number of Stasises or Copy Artifacts. So while the demand for those cards is significantly higher, this card is harder to find, and it also has a certain novelty because of its cool effect. So, those are the 10 most expensive enchantments in all of Magic. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at the most expensive Magic cards, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron, by buying Nietzahone merch, or by becoming a channel member. You can find ways to do all of that in the description. Thanks for watching.